My paper is really specific. It's not a general overview of New Zealand foreign policy. It's addressed to a specific issue. What is New Zealand's relationship to the Indo-Pacific concept? And because it's quite a specific topic, I'm going to give a little bit of context before I begin my paper proper. Okay. So traditionally, New Zealand has not adopted the regional descriptor, the Indo-Pacific. New Zealand largely prefers to use the term Asia-Pacific, which it still employs. However, with the increasing popularity of the term, particularly made so by the Trump administration, New Zealand has found itself in a position where it has to engage the concept of Indo-Pacific. So the question is, what is New Zealand's position? What explains its position? And is this position sustainable? Okay, so that's what my paper is going to address. What is New Zealand's position on the term or concept of Indo-Pacific? How does New Zealand benefit, or what advantages does it take from adopting this position? And to what extent can New Zealand maintain this position? I'd like to introduce some key figures in New Zealand foreign policy. Here you have our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Winston Peters, who is also the Deputy Prime Minister. And next to him is the Minister of Defence, Ron Marks. Now, what is interesting about these two figures is that New Zealand currently has a coalition government, and it's made up of three parties, and both our ministers that deal with external relations, Winston Peters and Ron Marks, come from one of the small parties called New Zealand First. And I think this is the first time we've had this situation where you've had two ministers dealing with external relations come from the smaller coalition party. What's also interesting is that both have indigenous heritage. And so what I've heard throughout the region is this puts especially Winston Peters in good stead with engaging Pacific leaders because of their indigenous background. But that's just a little bit of context, a little bit of background to who our foreign ministers or external relations ministers are. So what is New Zealand's position in relation to the concept of the Indo-Pacific? If you were to look at the rhetoric that has come out of the key players within our Ministry of External Relations, you will find that the Indo-Pacific hardly features. For example, our Minister of Defence, Ron Marks, was at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, and rather than employing the term Indo-Pacific, he employed the term Asia-Pacific, despite the fact that most of his peers were using Indo-Pacific. If you were to skip over to, so that's Ron Marks, and this is Ben King, who I'll talk about a little bit later. He's the Deputy Secretary for the Americas and Asia. And of course, Winston Peters. But if you were to also look at the key documents released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and New Zealand's Ministry of Defence, you'll find exactly the same thing. There is hardly any mention of Indo-Pacific and a preference for the use of the term Asia-Pacific. And where they do use the term Indo-Pacific, it's usually in a very passing sort of manner. They'll use it to describe certain stakeholder groups. There is no real attempt by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to define what Indo-Pacific means for New Zealand. It's the same thing if you were to read the Ministry of Defence documents. For example, in the 2018 publication called Strategic Defence Statement by the Ministry of Defence, as this one here, you'll find that the concept of Indo-Pacific is overshadowed by the concept of Asia-Pacific. And where New Zealand does use the term Indo-Pacific, it doesn't say this is New Zealand's position on Indo-Pacific. It says this is the position of our allies on the Indo-Pacific. So New Zealand is kind of passing the buck a little bit and saying, well, this is what Japan, Australia, and the United States have promoted as the Indo-Pacific. And here you have a little sample from this document of how New Zealand does this. It talks about Japan, Australia, and the United States promoting Indo-Pacific concepts, presenting India as an important strategic partner, so forth and so forth. In the same document, you'll find that New Zealand talks about Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific policy and what that entails. But you will not find in these documents New Zealand saying, this is what we think the Indo-Pacific is. So this raises the question, does this mean that New Zealand does not support the concept of the Indo-Pacific or the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific? On the contrary, New Zealand wholeheartedly supports this concept, but it doesn't do so in the same way as its allies and friends. So whereas New Zealand's allies and friends use the term freely and frequently, New Zealand doesn't. New Zealand foreign policy instead supports what the concept stands for without using the rhetoric. So for example, New Zealand supports the importance of India as a geopolitical and geo-economic actor. It supports the need to reinforce peace and stability. It supports economic prosperity. It supports respect for the rules-based international order. All of these things you will find in the Indo-Pacific concept as it's being used by its allies. But New Zealand is very hesitant to say this is what our version of the Indo-Pacific is. So as you can see from my analysis so far, it's more of a nuanced analysis of New Zealand foreign policy. So back to the question, does New Zealand support the concept? Of course it does, just not in rhetoric. Let me get to the second question that I'll address in this paper. So why does New Zealand take this position or approach? Now, as an outsider looking in, obviously the question is a mystery. And one can only speculate based on material that is publicly made available by the New Zealand government. The New Zealand policymakers will have their own explanations, but whether these can be trusted or not is debatable. Arguably, New Zealand's position can be explained in at least three ways. The first way that we can understand this position that New Zealand has taken is that it makes no difference to New Zealand whether it adopts a version of the Indo-Pacific or not. And I'm not supporting Hillary Clinton. I just looked up the term, what difference does it make, and that was the first picture that came up. But in any case, it makes no difference to New Zealand whether it adopts and gives meaning to this term or not. It doesn't add anything to its allies and friends' interests, except maybe to provide for a united front on the matter. So from a New Zealand perspective, if the substance of the foreign policy matches how the concept is employed and deployed by its allies, there's really no need to go further and say, here is New Zealand's version of the Indo-Pacific. The second reason I would argue for why New Zealand takes this position is, well, if it isn't broke, why fix it? New Zealand's geopolitical interests are well served by reference to the Asia-Pacific. And just because New Zealand's referent is Asia-Pacific, it doesn't limit their engagement with issues further afield. Furthermore, there's an uncertainty as to whether the term Indo-Pacific and its various associated meanings will have staying power in regional geopolitics. And one only has to look at what happened to Obama's pivot once Trump was elected to realize that geopolitical terms and how we think about geopolitical spaces can change very quickly. So New Zealand's sort of playing a wait-and-see approach. It's benefiting from the term Asia-Pacific. Why change it? The third reason why I would say New Zealand is hesitant to provide a version of the Indo-Pacific is that it would mean New Zealand would be going into somewhat of an unknown and potentially risky situation. New Zealand does not know how the United States, but in particular China, will react if New Zealand took a clear and firm position on the Indo-Pacific concept. So according to Ben King, who I mentioned earlier, he's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he says, for New Zealand, the evolution of the regional rules-based order and the development of new architecture, including the various free and open Indo-Pacific strategies, presents both risks and opportunities. So here's what I'm saying. New Zealand is looking at this and saying, this is a little bit of an unknown factor, an unknown field. Let's be cautious. And interestingly, in the same speech which he made last year, he says, I'll just say that New Zealand's present and our future is inextricably linked to the future stability and prosperity of, and note the geographical descriptors he uses and the order in which he uses them. He says prosperity of the Pacific, Asia, and the broader Asia-Pacific, and what others define as the Indo-Pacific region. So you can take something from this order to see how New Zealand views the concept. Currently, New Zealand is stuck between Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. And whether it makes that leap to embrace the Indo-Pacific concept is going to depend on a number of factors. In particular, how China will respond. The fourth reason why New Zealand takes this position, I think, is because New Zealand's current position helps it to avoid getting in the middle of a geopolitical standoff, or what has been referred to by some as a collision course between China and the United States. New Zealand wants to avoid getting in that position. It goes without saying that in foreign policy, words matter. And the employment of the term Indo-Pacific could be seen by China as support for a strategy intended to contain or hedge it in. So New Zealand wants to avoid this. What places New Zealand in a precarious situation is the fact that its two closest security allies have taken strong positions or adopted strong versions of the Indo-Pacific term. Australia, for example, employed the concept in its 2013 Defence White Paper. The concept was later cited in its 2016 Defence White Paper and 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. And Australia tends to employ the term to signify a compromise between its traditional and predominant security alliance with the United States, but also its economic dependence on China. Now, the meaning Australia has given to the term doesn't pose too many issues for New Zealand. What does pose issues for New Zealand is the way that the United States has framed or given meaning to this term. So it's well known that the Trump administration employs the concept in a way that targets China. The Trump administration employs the concept strictly in security and geostrategic terms. It signifies efforts to assert greater control over the Indo-Pacific in a clear effort to thwart Chinese expansionism. Now, although Trump's policy appears to be a continuity of past United States policy, there are clear differences from what existed previously under Obama. According to Thetinan Pongsutirik's analysis, I'm sorry if I didn't say that name correctly, both the United States and China viewed the United States' use of the concept as a signifier to restrict China's increasing influence in international relations. Now, from a New Zealand perspective, avoiding taking a clear position on the Indo-Pacific keeps New Zealand largely free of this issue. New Zealand is comfortable with the middle ground, appeasing both sides. But the question is, can New Zealand continue to hold this somewhat neutral position? Can it continue with this approach? Now, there are three factors that I would argue will ultimately determine whether New Zealand can maintain this neutrality or not. The first factor is whether New Zealand will have to choose between China and the United States. Several New Zealand political commentators, some who have previously worked in New Zealand's diplomatic corps, have noted that New Zealand is or will soon find itself in a position where it has to choose between the two countries. And when I say choose, I don't mean that in terms of absolutes. I mean it in terms of leaning one way or the other. Foreign policy is about incremental change, not absolute change. So, this is a quote from Michael Powell, who served in the New Zealand diplomatic corps for over 30 years and was also New Zealand's ambassador to China. And he highlights this issue of New Zealand having to choose between the two sides. He says, some observers suggest that a country in New Zealand's situation with strong relationships with both leading powers could avoid having to make difficult choices. We should follow the advice in the Chinese saying and retreat to the mountaintop and simply watch the two tigers fight down below. But what mountaintop and where? And as Meriden Barrow has written about Australia's options, the time during which a choice remains open will be limited, end quote. In other words, he's saying we're running out of time before we have to make a decision. Do we lean one way to China or the other way to the United States? So although New Zealand is currently not at that position yet, it may find itself in that position soon. The second factor of whether New Zealand can sustain this position is whether it can replace China as a source of economic trade benefits. Now, this is highly unlikely to happen. New Zealand has exerted considerable effort and been at the forefront of engaging China for trade. And many will understand this, that New Zealand has a number of firsts with its relationship with China. In 1978, New Zealand was the first country to accord China developing country status for trading purposes. 1997, first Western country to sign off on the bilateral paperwork that led to China being accepted into the WTO. 2008, first Western country to enter into a free trade agreement with China, and then the first country to upgrade that free trade agreement. 2015, first Western country to join China's Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. 2017, first Western country to sign a memorandum of agreement with the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative. So after you've exerted this much effort, you're not going to trade away your relationship with China, no pun intended. And why would New Zealand compromise its trade relationship? Given the benefits it derives from this, the current trade deal between the two countries significantly favors New Zealand. Of the 32 billion two-way trade, New Zealand has a 5.1 billion surplus. This free trade agreement has recently been upgraded to favor New Zealand even more. So if I can sum up this point in one sentence, it's this: China is far more important to New Zealand than New Zealand is to China. New Zealand cannot afford to give this trading relationship away. So, New Zealand's position: avoid controversy. Don't get into the debate about the Indo-Pacific. A third factor that explains New Zealand's position is that New Zealand is asking itself whether it can avoid the term lean towards China without compromising its security and other ties with the United States. From a New Zealand perspective, history would show it can do this. It can cause stress on its relationship with the United States without severing its ties. And where do we learn this from? The history of ANZUS. And as many of you know, New Zealand's anti-nuclear position led to the rupture of ANZUS, but even that rupture wasn't that significant. New Zealand wasn't invited to participate in the RIMPAC exercises. It didn't get the free trade deal it long sought for. But apart from that, New Zealand was still part of the Five Eyes network, still engaging America in scientific cooperation, especially via the Antarctica. There were a whole lot of other connections between the two countries. And whatever rupture did exist, this was healed by the signing of the Wellington Declaration in 2010 and then the Washington Declaration in 2012. And effectively, New Zealand and the United States are now de facto allies, even though our ministers have denied that. So from a New Zealand perspective, this is the kind of game it wants to play, middle ground to avoid these issues. What factors will determine whether what factors will determine New Zealand's position on the Indo-Pacific if it ever gets to the stage where it has to choose? Okay? So without looking into the future, we can only posit some of the factors that will help determine New Zealand's position. The last two factors I mentioned in the previous section are important. But in addition to these, the position of New Zealand's closest ally, Australia, is going to be critical to how New Zealand will define the Indo-Pacific if it ever gets to that point. If Australia adopts a military and security dimension in its version of the Indo-Pacific, more so than what it does now, New Zealand may very well have to follow suit. Why is this? Because New Zealand and Australia, their defense and security ties are simply too strong and intertwined for New Zealand to do otherwise. The Anzac Pact, which I have here, implores both countries to act in unison, be of the same mind when it comes to foreign and defense decisions. And of course, the Anzac Pact is supplemented by other agreements such as the closer defense relations. This is where we get this idea that New Zealand and Australia are a single strategic entity. So Australia's voice on this matter is going to be important if New Zealand ever has to have its own version of the Indo-Pacific. The position of the United States will also be important, especially after signing the Wellington and Washington declarations. So let me conclude by what is the way forward for New Zealand. New Zealand's current position on the Indo-Pacific concept is probably the most sensible one at this stage, but this can only be for the short term. New Zealand can get away with not taking a strong and possibly controversial position without compromising its economic ties with China and security ties with the US. However, whether New Zealand can sustain this position in the long term is questionable. It's going to depend on China-US relations and perhaps whether President Trump gets a second term or not. It'll also depend on what New Zealand's allies, and especially what Australia does. It'll depend on New Zealand-China relations. Are these robust enough for New Zealand to take a position that may appear out of line, may appear in line with the United States? So all these factors considered, what I can say is New Zealand's short-term option is sensible, but in the long term, it needs to come up with a different strategy. That's it.